Good afternoon. It is Thursday, March 28th, 2019 at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Advancement Live. I'm your host, John Horowitz, coming to you live from sunny and warm by New England standards, Hanover, New Hampshire. On today's live broadcast, we're talking about the Case for Alumni Engagement Metrics Framework. But before we get to that, a few words about today's broadcast. Advancement Live is part of the Higher Ed Live network. All of our episodes offer you direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Be a part of our live broadcast by sharing your knowledge. Participate in today's discussion by tweeting us using hashtag HigherEdLive. Today's live broadcast is powered by Platform Q Education's Conduit online engagement platform. Learn how to integrate continuous online engagement into your marketing and enrollment plans using Conduit. Visit platformqedu.com. All of our episodes are recorded. They're free and easy to access in the video archives at higheredlive.com, or take Higher Ed Live with you on the go by subscribing to the podcast. Today's broadcast is brought to you by iModules, higher education's leading alumni management software. Your goal is to develop lifelong relationships with your alumni and supporters. To achieve this, your institution needs to take advantage of multi-channel, personalized, and targeted communication opportunities. Encompass from iModules provides everything you need to effectively engage all of your audiences online. With one integrated solution, you'll increase engagement, raise more money, work more efficiently, and build your institution's legacy. That's the power of one integrated solution, and that's the power of iModules. Learn more at iModules.com. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. And now, on with the show. So there has been a long-term industry need and desire for a standardized way to measure alumni engagement. And today we're going to talk about a groundbreaking initiative from CASE that aims to significantly influence higher ed advancement and alumni relations teams. Joining me for this conversation is Fred Weiss, Chief Research and Data Officer at CASE, who previously spent 25 years working for technology companies that support educational advancement. Say hi, Fred.
Hey, John, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course. And also with us is Shelley Zaborowski, Executive Director of the Nebraska Alumni Association. A dual degree holder from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Shelley has been at the Alumni Association since she earned her first degree. Say hi, Shelley.
Hello.
Welcome.
Nice to have you all on.
Yes, and you as well. For those of you watching in your offices, remember, you're also a part of this conversation. So don't hesitate to ask us questions using hashtag HigherEdLive. I'll do my best to ask your questions as they come in, but first I'm going to start with a few of my own. So Fred, can you just provide some background on the CASE Alumni Engagement Metrics Project? What is it and how did it come about?
Yeah, John, happy to do that. And again, thanks for having me and having CASE as part of this conversation. So, as you mentioned, there's been a long-term industry need to have kind of a standardized framework for how alumni engagement gets measured. And there's a commission amongst CASE volunteers. It's called the Alumni Relations Commission. And they have been talking about this for a bit. About 3 years ago, they said, well, let's really put some volunteer muscle into this and see if we can come up with an industry-wide framework. The result of that conversation was the creation of a task force, and that task force had CASE volunteers from around the globe, from different institutions, sizes and shapes, and their work resulted in the publishing of a white paper that's actually available on case.org. That really is a draft framework for an industry standard for measuring alumni engagement. And so the result of that white paper, what that white paper really articulates is a way in which we might go ahead and measure this. And so the white paper articulates a series of inputs, things like the number of alumni and the number of alumni relations staff and things along those lines. But most importantly, it articulates and puts forward a framework that's based upon 4 categories of engagement. The first of those categories is philanthropic. The second of those categories is volunteerism. The third of those categories is experiential, what most people might think about as reunion or homecoming, but is a much broader area than that. And the fourth area is interactive, informative, and meaningful communication. So came from the Alumni Relations Commission, resulting in the task force, resulting in the publishing of this white paper.
Fred, can you quickly go into a little bit of detail about those 4 categories? Because those are the ones that I think a lot of us talk about, and we're intrigued by what falls into those buckets.
Yeah, so I think philanthropic, in order, philanthropic is probably the easiest one for most people to get their arms around. It really is individuals' connection to alma mater as a result of being involved in philanthropic financial support, regardless of whether that's through their own individual giving or through giving through third-party vehicles like family foundations. So that's philanthropic. Okay. Volunteerism is that big, huge ball of all of the activities that somebody might be involved with as a volunteer, everything from being a board member to being a career mentor to speaking in classrooms, a really, really big category of things. Experiential also covers a really wide field. So reunion and homecoming, but also things like ticket holders for cultural events or athletic programs. It also includes club and chapter types of activities. So again, a really, really big category. And then the 4th, quite frankly, is the most difficult to really get arms around because it's communication, but it's interactive, informative, and meaningful. And since so much of that communication is taking place today via social channels, and not a lot of institutions are actually, measuring engagement in those social channels, that's the one that is a little bit more difficult to wrestle to the ground. But there is some meat around all 4 of those. Those are really broad categories, and we expect those categories to be refined over time. But quite frankly, as we work through the framework, we also expect that case member institutions will build some of their own engagement items on top of those 4 general categories. Okay.
And the emphasis that we have to remind everyone is that this is on alumni engagement. So the focus is on alumni, not parents or other constituents, and the focus is on alumni relations. Is that correct, Fred?
It is, but you raise a really good point. So, a good portion of case membership, for example, are independent schools. And independent schools care very deeply about parental relationships and parental engagement. Not that higher ed doesn't, but it's a really big thing for K through 12 independent schools. We're tackling alumni first, but as I've told some of our members in the independent school sector as they've asked this question, first of all, we'll get there eventually. But secondly, quite frankly, I don't think there's anything in the framework that would limit them from using this framework to also measure engagement with that other really important group of constituents.
Okay. So, thinking ahead, is this framework a way to try to connect the dots between alumni engagement and fundraising? Is that the elephant in the room? Let's ask it. And if so, how so?
So I would certainly say not yet.
Okay.
First of all, keep in mind that that there are many ways to think about engagement with alma mater, and those 4 categories are only 4 of them, and philanthropy is one of them. But one of the things that we're doing is we're starting really simply. We're just looking at counting the number of alumni that are engaged in these ways. We're not trying to weight or score across the categories or even elements within a single category. And what we want to be really careful about is that we don't create spurious correlations. People who buy cigarettes wash their sheets more often. That seems like a weird thing, but that would be an example of a spurious, correlation. We're not trying to get there at this stage of the game. Who knows where this goes eventually as we understand the data better, but certainly that's not, our goal coming out of the gate. The gate is just to provide this framework.
Okay, and we do want to talk about what the future of this looks like. But right now, I do want to mention, I know Case has not done this alone. You've done this with the help of, quite a number of volunteers from different institutions. And so, Shelley, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about Nebraska's participation in this effort and what your role you're playing in this project.
Sure. So as Fred mentioned, there are a lot of volunteers involved in this, and the CASE's idea, I think, was to get representatives from institutions of varying sizes and shapes and locations. And so I really see my role as sort of representing kind of the mid to large public institution, U.S. institution. This is an international project, which adds to its complexity, but also, in my opinion, is excitement. I would also like to point out that I have a partner in advancement services who's also participating on behalf of Nebraska. And it's really nice to have this partnership so that we can each offer the perspective of the way we see things and what we're able to count, and kind of our different perspectives coming from alumni relations and advancement services. In terms of kind of what we're hoping to achieve, we're at the stage where we haven't really jumped off the diving board. I use the diving board analogy. We've been standing on the edge of the diving board, knowing that we want to jump into the measurement, engagement metrics, and engagement scoring pool, but we're not quite sure if the water's warm enough, and nobody's standing there pushing us off the diving board, but we just haven't quite been brave enough to jump in yet. So really hoping to get my arms around it and understand the framework before we dive into building our own engagement scoring platform.
Okay. And as you've done this work and talked with folks from other institutions, have you heard other thoughts on what they're hoping to get out of this, or Fred, if you've heard some of that sentiment?
I would say it's a lot of the same. We've talked for a long time about wanting to have sort of an apples to apples comparison, so that when we're talking to each other and we're attempting to make some comparisons, that we're all speaking the same language and I guess singing from the same hymnal. So I think the general consensus is that we want some standardization, and I think everyone recognizes that it's going to be complex and it's not going to be perfect, but we've got to start somewhere. So here we are.
Great. So you mentioned a great word, standardization. And when I think about that, I also think about, CASE's membership, which is vast. And I'm curious, how does CASE account for the vast differences across higher ed institutions when trying to create engagement metric standards? Is there really a standard for what alumni engagement should look like, or what capturing of metrics should look like?
So I'll jump in on this, and John, you're spot on. We've got 3,600 member institutions in over 80 countries. And that membership is, as I mentioned earlier, is both independent schools as well as higher ed institutions. And this project is really to cover that broad spectrum of educational institutions, not just higher ed. So the short answer is it's hard. But the longer answer is, I think the task force that drafted the white paper, and I think the folks involved in the beta, actually all believe that something is achievable for having an industry-wide framework that is global in scope. In fact, there's an argument to be made that this is actually the first time that CASE has ever tried to build something global from the ground. And I think there's a lot of buy-in to the fact that it's possible. The thing that we have to be really, really careful about is terminology. So how we refer to our institutions and the types of degrees they offer is one example. And even examples of how alumni engagement programs vary across geographies. At some schools, there may be a really big emphasis on study abroad programs, or some schools in some countries may have much stronger study abroad programs than there might be in other geographies. So we have to really work through that. But again, I think that the task force and the group of institutions that Shelley's a part of, the beta group that we've been working with, actually, really believe that this is important and doable. Now, what I would also say is what we're talking about is essentially a baseline framework, and we're strong believers that CASE members can take that baseline framework and build on top of it. And that building on top of it allows them to include things that are reflective of the uniquenesses of their culture, their institutions, their geographies. And we think those are things that are really, really helpful. But again, this allows that baseline understanding across institutions and across geographies.
And I think that's a great point for our audience to understand, is that this is not, a suggestion for institutions to change the way they're doing things if they're already capturing alumni engagement metrics. This is simply a guide and something that can help them and help create standards across the industry that can only hope to better the work that we do. So we've got a baseline of understanding of this. I'm curious, what are the next steps to launching this? What's next for CASE?
Well, the process that Shelley is involved with, and Shelley, feel free to weigh in a little bit more on this if you'd like. So as she referenced, we've got a group of global institutions with representation from both alumni relations and advancement services, because we want this to be that partnership. And what they are helping us do is understand how each of those categories, the definitions in each of those categories get refined. So, for example, in the white paper, there was a really broad definition of alumni, but we know that institutions of various shapes and sizes and in different geographies look at alumni in different ways. So let's refine definitions of alumni. Let's refine definitions of who is a contactable alum. And then even within the four categories, experiential as an example, let's refine the ways in which we want to look at counts of alumni who participated experientially. So there's that piece of it. So that's the first part, refining the definitions. And I'll pause. Shelley, do you want to weigh in on anything about that process?
Sure. I mean, it's been a really interesting conversation, the different definitions that people have and trying to kind of arrive at a standard that we can all agree with. But I would say it's been less difficult than I expected. It's been a robust and interesting conversation, but there's also a real, I think, effort by CASE to say that we want to make all this information available, and then we want you to be able to pull out what's meaningful to you, to your institution. So there may be things that are being discussed on these in our conference calls that may have no relevance at all to me or to somebody else on the call. But the idea is to try to cover as much ground as possible, knowing that we'll all be able to customize this in a way that's meaningful and relevant to us.
And what happens next after we refine those definitions is that we ask each of the participating institutions in the beta to now actually get data out of their systems aligned with those definitions. And the thing that I want to be really clear about is that we look at these definitions as iterative. People have heard me talk about them as being, 83% done. Because even going through the data collection process, we're getting questions from folks. So what about this and what about that? And it means we have an opportunity to refine them over time. So we're actually just beginning the process of asking the beta participants to extract data out of their systems, and then we'll see where that goes. Once we get through the definitions, the testing of the data extraction, then we go to a global launch. I've said it at a variety of CASE conferences that our goal is to get to a global launch this summer. But I say that only as a goal because we have to see how the process that we're going through continues to move forward.
Okay.
And I would say that the point where we're at with our team is we've looked at what these draft definitions what they say and what they've been created as. And we're now going through and saying, okay, these are the things that we can count today and that we've got a good grasp of. These are the things that if we took the time and invested some effort into it, we could count. These are the things that are probably out of our control to count, but over time we would like to get there. And gosh, these are the things on the list that we're just not going to be able to invest the time and resources into counting. So for us as participating institutions, that's where we are in the process too.
Great. So thinking ahead to that global launch, and we'll be optimistic and say it is this summer, when this does go wider and schools want to participate, is this going to require the schools themselves or the technology providers that they're working with around this data to change processes, to change data fields or anything else? Is this going to cause disruption?
That's a great question. So here's the way I look at it. In fact, Shelley you almost owe Shelley $5, John, because she kind of set you up for that question, I think. I think we do believe that some of this data is going to be easier and some of it's going to be harder for a variety of our members to get. What we don't want to do is have that as a limitation for their participation, because we do think that everybody who can participate and everybody will get value out of it as they begin to see what others are doing. But just like when our fundraising surveys, the Ross Case survey in the UK and Ireland, when that got launched, when our fundraising survey in Australia and New Zealand got launched, when VSE got launched and has been refined, as all of those instruments have been refined, we know that our members sometimes have to make some data adjustments and refinements on the back end in order to participate in those instruments. So it's likely that something will need to be done, but we think that what's really important here is just starting with something. If we can get to a place where we think we've got 87% of the work done, and we've got a good number of case members participating to the degree that we can, that is 87% more than we actually have today. And we do expect to engage with technology providers, what we call our educational partners, to get them to help their clients and our members to make it easier to get that data out of their back-end systems. So I'm not sure I love the word disruption. How about change instead? That may be required.
Well, and I think it may encourage institutions to look at things a little differently, maybe be a little bit more intentional about what they're tracking. And my hope also is that some of our campus partners, some from the colleges and academic units and even student organizations will kind of be excited about this, and that will encourage them to also share some of that data with us that right now we're not getting, or takes great effort to receive. But our hope is that it's going to intrigue our campus partners into being more active participants in engagement tracking as well.
That's a really great point. This is really, could be the catalyst for an opportunity to do more with streamlining data collection efforts and data analysis efforts across an institution. That's a really interesting point.
Agreed.
Okay. So I'm curious. Have you heard any? Right now, I think we're thinking positively, and that's the hope here. Have you heard any negative, Fred or Shelley, from either working with the beta group or Fred? I know you've talked about this effort at a number of conferences recently. Are there any concerns that are bubbling up at this point?
Well, Shelley, you want to weigh in first on this? I certainly can raise it, can talk about it too.
Sure. Well, I guess I think from the beta group, I think we feel really good about the definitions where they are. And again, Fred reminded me that these are all drafts, working drafts, ongoing working drafts. So I think we feel good about where we are with the definitions. But I think we kind of all had this aha moment on the last conference call where we kind of went, oh my gosh, now we actually have to do this. It is a little bit daunting. I'm not going to lie. There's a lot of columns in the spreadsheet that we're working from. But I think it's important to focus on, and as our team internally has looked at this, I think it's important to focus on that we're gonna focus on the things that are meaningful and relevant to our institution. I think there's maybe concern that it is going to be daunting, but I think if you take baby steps, I think we're going to be in really good shape. And I think this beta group is kind of the guinea pigs. We're gonna try this out, and then we'll have a better idea of. We're getting out of this what we thought we would get out, or gosh, this part didn't work and we need to tweak this and rethink this. So kudos to my colleagues in the beta group who are going to be the guinea pigs here. But overall, I think the response has been positive.
Yeah, and I think what I'd add is, one of the things that we've talked about is, so keep in mind, we're not talking about engagement only in each of the individual 4 categories, but we're talking about engagement across the 4 categories. So, for example, what's the count of the number of alumni who are engaged philanthropically and experientially? What's the count of the number of alumni that are engaged as volunteers and experientially? What's the count of the number of alumni who are participating in three of the 4 categories, and in all 4 of the categories? There's really good insight that I think can come from this. And so, this is really important. It's the ability to show the level of engagement. And as we do this, we expect to collect this data on an annual basis. And so what also begins to build is the longitudinal view of changes in levels of engagement. And I think there too, there is really, really high value as institutions think about the best way to leverage the data and then can see the impact on results over time.
I think that's go ahead, Shelley.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add, I think one concern that I've heard is that, is this going to be used as, making a case for eliminating specific programs or eliminating alumni relations? And my personal opinion is it's just the opposite. I think this really lends credibility to what we're doing. We're really lucky at Nebraska that we've got our campus and our development leadership that really believe in alumni relations and understand it. But I know that's not the case everywhere. And I think that this is a way to really show in some quantitative way what we're doing to the people who may think that, we just plan parties and sell merchandise. So I think the opposite is true. I think this lends a lot of credibility to the work that we do.
I think you nailed it, Shelley. That's exactly how I feel like. I feel like that credibility is key to combating the mindset that alumni relations is just about parties or that, things are not done strategically. I think this is going to show where things can go, where things, where there's been success, where there are opportunities, and where things can go, and how this can drive future participation, whether that participation is defined as additional alumni engagement or other opportunities for alumni to be involved as volunteers, as mentors, as donors. I think it's a fantastic opportunity that this could bring.
Yeah, I will say, the number of times that I've spoken about this, I always start out those presentations by asking people, asking the audience how many people are actually doing, some type of measurement today of engagement scoring. And then I'll always ask the second question, how many people are building out an engagement score of some type that they're thinking about launching? And then the third is, how many people are scared as hell and not sure what to do. And I'd say roughly it's about a third. But I would say that I very rarely hear from anybody who says, no, we shouldn't do this. Now, John, you just spoke at a case conference, and one of your co-panelists wasn't she of the opinion that maybe we shouldn't be doing this, or did I misinterpret?
No, you did not misinterpret. The session was called "A Score to Settle," but it didn't get to fisticuffs or anything. But it was talking about the merits of engagement scoring versus simply doing good in-depth analytics, but not assigning scores to it. So it was an interesting conversation, and I think there's merit to both options. But I'm glad you brought up engagement scoring, because I'm curious, could this project, I know it's early, but could this project lend itself toward providing guidelines, suggestions around engagement scoring?
So I'll give you my perspective. I'm sure Shelley has a perspective as well. So first of all, to be clear, coming out of the gate, we are not doing any weighting or scoring. I think I referenced this earlier. So by example, we're not saying that, being a career mentor is more or less important than, speaking in a classroom as a volunteer activity. That being said, I think that a lot of institutions have to think about this for themselves. What are the things that they place value on for their own purposes? I would think that here at CASE, we would not be the ones that would, begin to say this is more important than that. I think that's an institutional decision based upon, again, uniqueness of cultures, history, geography, and that's where that type of scoring might come into play. But that's my opinion. Shelley, I don't know if you've thought about this.
Yeah, I think comparison would be really difficult. Trying to compare yourself against another institution at this early phase in the game based on these metrics, just because initially there's going to be vast differences in what institutions are able to count. So just based on time and resources and technology and tools, I think this is going to take some time for everyone to kind of figure out individually just simply what they can count, simply what data is available before we start looking at sort of a universal scoring. I don't know. I guess I don't know where I think this will go eventually, but I think this is step one. I think it will be really helpful to institutions. I certainly hope it will. I know it will be to us. But I think in terms of this kind of universal engagement scoring, I think we're a long way off from that.
Okay. I want to pause quickly just to remind the audience that if you have any questions for us, please tweet them to #HigherEdLive. I know that this has been quite a captivating conversation so far, so we will continue with our questions until you have some. So I want to kind of look ahead. We've hinted at this a little bit, but let's talk a little bigger with this effort. And how do we feel that this might, inform or influence recommendations for wider application of alumni engagement metrics tracking, be that related to analysis or predictive modeling or otherwise?
Well, I think predictive modeling would be extremely valuable. But as I mentioned before, I think we're probably a long way off from that. But I think that's something that would be really helpful to alumni associations and institutions in general. And gosh, if we could get there with this long term, I think that would be terrific.
So for CASE, this is part of an overall initiative that we have called AM Atlas, Advancement Metrics Atlas. And that initiative, our big, hairy, audacious goal is for CASE to be the global resource for educational advancement, metrics, benchmarks, and analytics. And so for us, this fits into, this is a distinct set of measurement in a particular practice area that CASE emphasizes within advancement. We do work in fundraising, obviously. We've done some work in marketing communications. We hope to do more work in advancement services. I think that what ultimately it does is it begins to really give a very good and broad picture of the value of advancement to an institution to transform lives in society. And so for us, we think that there's a great opportunity here to allow us over time to look at things like predictive and prescriptive modeling. But to Shelley's point, I think, first of all, a lot of our members are a long way from that, and certainly CASE is a long way from that, but it is part of our aspirational goal. We definitely think there's a lot that can be done here with data like this and data from the other work that we do globally that begins to give us a much broader picture of the impact of advancement activity.
Okay. We do have a question from Twitter, and this is kind of an open-ended one, so I'll just throw it out and tee it up and see which one of you wants to take it. The question is simply: aren't metrics inherently comparative? What do you think about that? Think about that one, and how does that play into this project and this effort?
Well, I guess I can take a stab at answering that. I think that that's true, and metrics are inherently comparative, but I think the emphasis of this project is we're all going to be asked to submit whatever data we want to submit, whatever data we feel comfortable with, either an exact count or a good faith estimate, and then we're going to be able to look and simply use the pieces that are meaningful and relevant to us. So I kind of see the first iteration of this as just what's out there. I think over time, it maybe becomes a more comparative, a way to use it comparatively. I guess I feel like at this stage, we're just trying to see what's out there and how we might want to use it before we try to use it as a tool for comparison.
And I would agree. I mean, if we look at the history of some of the other quantitative instruments that CASE has, like Ross CASE or VSE, we know that ultimately those have become tools by which institutions can compare themselves. But it takes time until people have faith in the maturity of the instruments, number one. Number two is even when they are, or if they are used in a comparative nature, I think, what's really incumbent is that everybody has to understand that those metrics are only one input. There are lots of stories behind all of the data. There are cultural differences and histories that are different as well between and among institutions. Various institutions have or do place emphasis in different parts of their programming. So it's just a single data point that needs to mature over time, but always has to be placed in context with what an institution is doing otherwise, or what it's trying to achieve, or where it has come from.
That's a good point. And Fred, you brought up another question that I want to ask. We talked about engagement scoring as a potential outcome of this. What about will CASE do anything in terms of offering guidelines for analytics? So there's the capturing of this data, but what about best practices in terms of analytics to so that people can get to that point of understanding what's going on in their alumni relations groups, what strategies and opportunities there might be?
So I'll give a somewhat of a blended answer. It's a good question, John. So part of AM Atlas, the initiative that I referenced earlier, is to lead to best practice and thought leadership articulation on the part of CASE based upon our engagement with members and what members provide us in both quantitative and qualitative instruments. And we actually do see that part of what we can offer up to our members better education or more education about how to use data to make decisions. That being said, we've got really great educational partners that are the ones that really can work very, very closely with individual institutions to help them understand what are strategies that they might pursue based upon the data that they've got at their disposal. And of course, there are all the conversations that take place amongst and between CASE members, whether they be at CASE conferences or at Drive, the conference that you and I were at a couple of weeks ago, CASE's Data and Analytics Conference. So I do think that again, part of our mission and our goal is to gather the data and use it to influence thinking. But again, there's a lot that goes on well beyond CASE through our educational partners and just that dialogue amongst and between members to allow them to understand how to derive more value.
Great. So let's look ahead a little bit. Let's go way past the launch that's happening this summer. Let's be aspirational. And how might this work, transform advancement, be that an individual shop, or alumni relations or advancement, be that individual shops or the industry as a whole?
I suppose my hope would be that it would help our campus leaders better understand advancement. I think for many, fundraising and philanthropy is sort of what comes to mind when a lot of our campus partners think about advancement. My hope is that over time this helps everyone understand that there's so much more to it than that. And there's so many more facets of advancement that are valuable to an institution. And I hope that it helps grow the partnerships in college deans, for example, being truly our partners in advancement. So that's my hope.
And I'll add to that a little bit. So first of all, in some geographies around the globe, advancement activity is used as a way to rank colleges and universities. And for those of you, that are participating today in the live stream, certainly know that U.S. News uses alumni participation as one way or one input to its ranking of colleges and universities. I would hope that one of the really big outcomes, I think Case hopes this, not just me, is that measurement gets replaced with a broader measurement of alumni engagement, much like the framework that we're working on. So a long-term aspiration that a broader context of alumni engagement with alma mater is the thing that ultimately, begins to weigh into some of these industry rankings. So that would be one. I think another one might be, we talked about this earlier, expanding this framework into other constituent types to better understand their attachment to the institutions that they have expressed interest in some way, shape, or form. I think as well that, I think this is kind of weighing in more on what Shelley had to say, that it allows a better understanding such that it influences strategy and investment a little bit more because we have a measure that we can look at. So I think those would be the three that I might think about.
I'm glad you brought up the rankings, Fred. That's something that, if you do well in the rankings, you love them. And if you're not where you want to be, you think that they're not worthwhile. But I think that it's something that, it's a way to be a little bit more intentional and a little bit, give a truer picture of that piece of the rankings, of the alumni engagement and investment piece.
That's a great point. So we are actually nearing the end of our time here on this episode of Advancement Live. So I want to ask Shelley, do you have anything any last words you want to share before we leave?
I guess I would just say that, it's a process. It's going to evolve over time. This is a pilot, and be not afraid. This is a good thing for our industry. This is something that we need a lot of people to invest the time in to be participants in this so that we can work through it and improve it over time.
That's great. So Fred, how can people stay informed about this initiative, and if they want to get involved, how can they?
So thanks for asking, John. So first of all, keep an eye on all of the Case communications vehicles, whether that's Briefcase, which comes out weekly, or case.org, or Case Currents. Definitely keep an eye on those vehicles. So that's number one. Number two is, of course, we'll be proactively emailing our membership, especially those in alumni relations and advancement services, as we get closer to finalizing the definitions, as well as closer to global launch, in order to make sure that there's very high awareness. And as we communicate on those things, and as we move forward and closer to global launch when it does occur, I would encourage, come on in. The water's warm. It feels really good. Because an effort like this is influenced by everybody's participation and influences everybody's participation. And of course, we hope that everybody's boat gets raised a little bit by participating in this. So don't have a fear of the water's cold. Come on in. And then if you have specific questions, feel free to email us at alumnimetrics@case.org. And that's an email address that we've got set up to handle questions that we might get from our members. Or you can email me directly at fweiss@case.org. Happy to answer the types of questions that folks might have, should they occur after this live stream or just as time goes on.
Great. Thanks for sharing all that, Fred, and thanks for making yourself available to the audience and to the folks in the industry. We also, on the Higher Ed Live Twitter account, we're sharing some of the resources around this so that if people want to do further research after the episode, they can. So again, I want to say thank you to our sponsor, iModules, and as always, thank you to M. Stoner for putting on this episode of Advancement Live, and a huge thank you to Shelley and Fred for being a part of this really important conversation, and I hope to continue the conversation on Twitter and offline. So for now, I'm John Horowitz, signing off from Hanover, New Hampshire. Take care.
Thanks, Shelley. Thanks, John. Thanks.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye.